10 different players have won the 9-ball World Championship between 2010 and 2019. But are those titles all made equal? Well, no, not exactly. So, who won the most difficult 9-ball World Championship of the past decade? What I did is, for each year, I looked in details into all the matches that the future champion had to go through to win the tournament. Then, I created a point system based on several criteria. If you beat an ex-champion, someone who has won the 9-ball world title in the past, you get some extra points. If you beat a 5-star player, you get a certain number of points. And if you beat a 4-star player, you get a bit less points. And then, you don't get any points for beating players that I consider 3-star players. For instance, I gave SVB a 5-star rating, while Dennis Grabe gets a 4-star rating, and someone like Alok Kumar gets a 3-star rating. Of course, this is very subjective, as I am the one defining who is a 3, 4, 5-star player. But I've looked at so much historical data that I'm pretty confident this star rating is fair and accurate. Then, you also get extra points for winning a heel-heel situation. Because playing a heel-heel situation at the World Championship will always add a lot of extra pressure. So I thought I would give a little reward for any player that comes out on top of such situation. Then I've actually deducted points if a player has lost a game in the group stage. Now, in some tournaments, when you lose and move to the loser bracket, you usually end up having to play a lot more matches than players in the winner bracket. But at the World Championship, it's not really the case. In the loser bracket, you only play one more match. And actually, in 2019, you could lose once in the group stage and still go through without even having to play any additional match. So all that means that losing a game in the group stage doesn't really make your path harder. Therefore, I've penalized players in my point system for losing matches. And finally, there are a few exceptions for which I might add or remove points. For instance, if an opponent was disqualified for any reason, a player would lose points because he was able to move on to the next round without even having to play a game, which obviously means that his path to victory was made easier. Another example of an exception is the fact that the 2019 World Championship only had 96 participants instead of the usual 128, which made Fedor's path to the title just a little bit easier than usual. So I'll remove some points for that. Now that I've established the criteria, let me take a minute to clarify something very important. There are no easy World Championship titles. All 10 of those titles were amazing achievements. But amongst champions, at the highest level of competition, you have to look at the smallest little details in order to separate the performances. And that's what I'm doing here. So, here are the 10 winners, and here are their detailed path to the championship. In yellow are all the heel-heel matches. In red are all the lost matches. The little trophy icon means that this is a player that had previously won the 9-ball world title. Now, after taking into account the player's star rating that I created, let's add the total points from my scoring system. And finally, let's reorder that list with the hardest championships at the top. Based on all the criteria I've explained before, Albin Ouschan's win in 2016 comes out on top as the hardest 9-ball world championship of the past decade. And when you look at the details of who he had to beat to win it, it's really hard to disagree. I mean, look at the group stages for a start. First, he had to beat Roberto Gomez, who reached the final back in 2007 and currently represents the Philippines at the World Cup of Pool. Then he had to beat Antonio Gabica in a tough heel-heel match. And Gabica also reached the final of this event 3 years before. Those are two really tough group stage matches, and none of the other 9 winners had to go through something like that. Then, once he reached the knockout stage, things didn't get easier. He had to beat, in order, Jeffrey Ignacio, Francisco Sanchez Ruiz, Mario He, Jayson Shaw, Alex Pagulayan, and then Shen Van Boening in the final. No matter who you are, there is a scary list of players to compete against, especially Jayson Shaw and SVB, who are two of the most successful players of the past decade. So beating both of them in the latter stage of the 9-ball World Championship is quite an achievement. And that final against SVB really was something special because SVB had just lost in the final the year before, while Albin had also lost in the final the year before that. So they both had extra motivation, as neither of them wanted to lose in the final for the second time. If I compare the number 1 spot with the number 10 spot, which is Carlo Biado's title, I think you would agree that this passes the eye test. You would have a really hard time arguing that Biado's path to the title was more difficult than Albin's. Especially that Biado didn't even have to play his quarterfinal match against Liu Haito, who got disqualified for arriving too late for his match. The poor guy forgot to wake up. Now if I compare the number 1 spot with the number 2, the difference is a little less obvious, as Thorsten's path to his win back in 2013 was also ridiculously difficult. He had to beat Darren Appleton, who was virtually unstoppable back in those days. Then he had to beat arguably the 2 best 9-ball Filipino players in Dennis Okoyo and Carlo Biado. But his group stage wasn't as tricky as Albin's group stage. Antonio Gavica and Roberto Gomez are substantially better than Mehdi Razeki and Loli Wen, and you'd expect Thorsten Homan to beat them both easily. Now, it's true that because of his loss, he had to play a 3rd group stage match, which means he played 1 more match than Albin, and that additional match was against no other than past champion Francisco Bustamante, so that's no easy feat. But it doesn't change the fact that Thorsten lost a group stage match where he was a heavy favourite, so I had to remove some points from his score. Still, what an impressive achievement it was to go through that lineup of players. While I was looking at all this data, I found a lot of interesting facts. Carlo Biado, Albin ouschan and Shane van Boening all reached 2 finals in the past decade, but SVB was the only one to lose both of them. SVB, alongside Jayson and Dennis Okoyo, are probably the best 3 players of the past decade, but none of them managed to win the 9-ball world title. During that 10-year period, looking at who reached the last 16 the most often, Copigny comes out on top as he managed to reach the last 16 8 times while also winning the whole thing back in 2015. And his title, by the way, is ranked as the 3rd hardest according to my scoring. 8 times in the last 16 in 10 years, that is unbelievable. Carlo Biado is 2nd on that list as he managed to reach the last 16 6 times. He won it once in 2017, but he's been quite unlucky with the draw because I noticed that every single one of the other 5 times he got to the last 16, he was eliminated by none other than the future champion. The biggest underachiever of the decade was probably Jayson when it comes to the 9-ball world championship. He made only 1 appearance in the last 16, which is very surprising and disappointing given how strong and dominant he was between 2010 and 2019. SVB reaching the final in 2015 was the first time an American reaches that stage of the tournament since 2002 when Earl Strickland last won the title. Out of 160 players that reached the last 16 over that 10-year period, only 9 were Americans, and 5 of those were SVB. He has been the only American hope for a title. On the other hand, the Filipinos have reached the last 16 34 times, and the Taiwanese 26 times, so those 2 countries are emphatically the 2 best in the world when it comes to 9-ball. In the end, Albin ouschan won the hardest 9-ball world championship title of the past decade. Copigny probably deserves to be called the king of 9-ball, and for the next 9-ball world championship, it's probably a safe bet to put your money on either a Taiwanese or a Filipino player.